So as we pick up here with around the year 70, and as we mentioned last time, with the end of the Roman revolt, there's a major expulsion of Jews. Famously, I'm sure you've seen the Arch of Titus, right? Or at least pictures of that in Rome, which is a relief of a massive arch that the Romans put up everywhere. But this one in particular has Jewish iconography of soldiers bringing back treasures from the temple. And then a final revolt in 135 of the Common Era, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which basically ended any significant Jewish population in the land of Israel for quite some time. There were certainly pockets, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. But with the destruction of the temple in 70 and in 135 of the Common Era, really it was disastrous for the Jews. And yet, this begins the time of the great proliferation of and reinvention of what being Jewish is all about, because this is the beginning of the rabbinic period, and up to this point, Judaism, if we could call it that, was a temple-based practice, or was a temple-based faith and temple-centric Judaism. So every aspect of Jewish life centered around Jerusalem and the temple. And yet, even so, going back 100 years or so, you have this thing called the synagogue, where people would gather there to recite prayers and to have communal meals and to study and learn and things like that, and to interpret text. Right? By this point, we have a canonized text of what we call the Bible. And Josephus, the famous historian of the era, even talks about the 5 books of Moses and the prophets and the other writings. And he talks about 24 books. So even by the time of Josephus, around this time period, we have this idea. And even in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, they when they speak about Scripture, they speak about the law and the prophets and the other writings, right? So there's this 3-part breakdown of what we know as the Bible already in place at this time. Now, what I'm going to focus on the next few minutes is the emergence of the rabbinic period. And what's so fascinating about this is that the rabbis the rabbis don't do history. The rabbis create memory. And the way they create memory is through fanciful storytelling. Now, are these stories true or factual? Probably not, because they were recorded hundreds of years after the events that they might have taken place. But they are fanciful storytelling that helps explain and puts into context the events. So there's a very famous story from the Talmud about a man named Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Yochanan ben Zakkai founds the first post-destruction academy of Jewish learning in the coastal town of Yavne. And there's a very famous story in the Talmud that he wanted to get out of Jerusalem, because he knew Jerusalem, like it was on its last legs. Jerusalem was about to be just taken over by the Romans. And very famous story that he couldn't get out because the zealots, the really zealous crazies, wouldn't let him out of the city. They're like, no, we're all going to die here. You can't leave. So what he did is he put himself in a coffin, and he had people carry him out of the city in a coffin. And they said, Yochanan ben Zakkai is dead. And some of the zealots said, well, we want to stab him to make sure. And like, you want to desecrate a body just to make sure he's dead. We just want to carry him out to bury him outside the city. So they lie to the zealots. They get out of the city, and they go right to Vespasian, who is who later becomes Roman emperor, which is important in a second. And they take Yochanan ben Zakkai in this coffin directly to the general Vespasian, and Yochanan ben Zakkai approaches the general and says, he kind of becomes prisoner, again, there's different versions of the story. Does he become prisoner first? Does he talk to Vespasian first? unimportant. But what's important is that Yochanan ben Zakkai, according to this legend, says, you're going to be king one day because only a king can destroy Jerusalem. And I know you're going to destroy Jerusalem, so I know you're going to be king. And Vespasian's like, okay, fine, sounds good to me. Here, sit in prison until I decide what to do with you. And while he's sitting in prison, there's the big revolt in Rome, and in Rome they proclaim Vespasian king or emperor, right? Because Romans hate kings; they call themselves emperors or first citizen, right? And very famously, Vespasian says, "Hey, you were right. I'm going to reward you. What do you want, Yochanan ben Zakkai?" And Yochanan ben Zakkai, give me the town. It says, give me the town of Yavne so that I can rebuild and start an academy of learning. And Vespasian says, great, here it is. You could do it. And Vespasian goes back to Rome, and his son Titus takes over and destroys Jerusalem. And so again, very famous story there about how that works. But what you have here is rabbinic academies begin both on the coast of the land of Israel, and then a little bit later in the north and the Galilee. And as I say, and as I'll show you in this, I'll share my screen just a second. Right, so 70 to 700 CE, rabbinic Judaism and formation, development of class of sages and rabbinical schools of study and interpretation. Right, fall of the Second Temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai founds Center for Legal Study and Administrative Rule in Yavne, Conference of Canonization of Biblical Literature at Yavne. So this is what I was talking about a minute ago. So Yochanan ben Zakkai founds the school of Yavne, and others who escape Jerusalem have basically decide what goes in the Bible, right? The canonization. Now, did they decide this? Probably not. There's probably the traditions were established by then, but again, this is the rabbinic retelling of how they thought about it. And they have debates on what books go in the Bible. But you know what? The rabbis have debates over everything. And that's the beauty of what becomes the Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud. And what the rabbis do is they create, they use nothing less than a revolutionary, because they create a temple, they change a temple-centered Judaism for a Judaism on the go, right? That a practice, right? Every holiday in the Torah focuses on bringing offerings to God in Jerusalem, or at least in the Mishkan, which is the forerunner of the temple. Well, what happens when you don't have that anymore? Well, the rabbis ingeniously adapt for a Judaism on the go. And so Passover is no longer about just sacrificing the Pesach offering. It becomes an 8-day or 7-day festival of unleavened bread, in which on the first night you have this elaborate storytelling, which we call the Seder. Shavuot no longer becomes this holiday of bringing offerings and ending the spring harvest season, but it becomes the date that we commemorate and celebrate the receiving of Torah at Sinai. Rosh Hashanah is not Rosh Hashanah is not really Rosh Hashanah. It's just a day of sounding and the first day of the 7th month in the Torah. For the rabbis, they transform it into the head of the year, the day of judgment, the day when the heavenly host and is judged by God, and we sound the shofar to announce the new year and to tell ourselves to repent. Yom Kippur is no longer just the day that the high priest performs some very articulate and intricate rituals in the temple on behalf of the people, but Yom Kippur becomes the day that every single person atones for his or her own sin. So and every aspect of Judaism becomes holy, that you say blessings and you eat certain foods at certain ways and certain times, and you act a certain way and you behave a certain way and you practice a certain way that has very little to do with the temple. And so this process is nothing less than revolutionary and ingenious, and creates a Judaism on the go. And one of the things, the terms that the rabbis use, and I like to use to explain what they're doing, is that they call, the temple was the Beit HaMikdash, the house of holiness, literally. But what they do, mikdash means holy place. And so the home becomes a mikdash me'at. The home becomes a small sanctuary, a small temple. So our tables at home, our homes are the centers of our holy spaces and that's where we practice holiness. It's ingenious. It really is ingenious that they did this. And they also created a dialogical, conversational kind of development where we have conversations about what is practice and what is ethics, and so a conversation in the Talmud is, as I'll bring this up in just a second. Let me bring this timeline up because it has some important terms here. A conversation in the Talmud is the Mishnah, written by or composed by Rabbi Judah the Prince, which is the written digest of the oral traditions and rules of the Tanaim. And then it is the Gemara, the conversations about that. And so you have a pithy statement of Mishnah, and then you have the Gemara, which is a conversation back and forth, an argument among people living in different places and different times over generations. And so the Mishnah was written around the year 200 of the Common Era. And the Mishnah was taken to different places around the land of Israel and also to Babylonia, because the Babylonian Jewish community, which, as I mentioned last week, disappears for 1,000 years, right? The Babylonian Jewish community, they were there with that's when Ezra and Nehemiah came back to the land of Israel in like the year 500 of before the Common Era, and we don't hear from them for 1,000 years. But by 500, 600 of the Common Era CE, there's such a robust Jewish community that when things kind of peter out in the land of Israel, Babylonia has these monster rabbinic academies where dozens of rabbis are creating the formative document of Judaism, right? The Babylonian Talmud. So you have these Babylonian rabbinical academies and the development of vast commentaries on the Mishnah called the Talmud by Amoraim, which this group of rabbis is called, right? And the what's called the Yerushalmi or the Palestinian Talmud is the Talmud that appears in the land of Israel, finished about the year 500-ish of the Common Era. And then you have the Babylonian Talmud, which is finished in Babylonia around the year 600. The Babylonian Talmud is much more authoritative. That's what everybody studies and covers and interprets for the next few thousand years up to today, 1,500 years up to today. And it's much more organized, much more well edited, much better edited. And these great Babylonian academies produce, right, as I said, the most important document in Jewish tradition, even more so than the Bible, I would say. Well, it's a close tie, but in the sense that we don't practice the Judaism of the Bible, because there is no Judaism. We practice the Judaism of the Talmud, both in style and in form. And what I mean by that is, in form, right? By the Babylonian Talmud is the Talmud that lays out the prayer service that we have and the blessings and the order of things that we have and how we practice the holidays and the ethics and the stories that we tell, but also the dialogical, right? In style, I mean that the Talmud of this conversational aspect of Judaism, right? We understand our tradition by arguing about it. We come to a decision by arguing, or we don't come to a decision and we say, you do it this way and we do it this way, and that's fine because that's how our tradition determines that, and allows us to determine that for ourselves. And there's also midrashic creativity in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, that this is the non-legal creativity, which is all legend and lore, and interpretations, narrative interpretations of our sacred of the Bible. Right? There's a question in the Bible, then we go back to midrash, and midrash kind of helps flesh that out for us. A very famous story that I'll tell. Many of you have probably heard this before, but another famous story that is a pivotal story for rabbinic tradition in the Babylonian Talmud. Basically, sets the stage for Jewish interpretation and human creativity within Jewish interpretation. So the very famous story. It starts off with a legal issue of very little importance. It's the purity of an oven, the ritual purity of an oven, and one of the things, so one Rabbi Eliezer says, I think the oven is impure. I can't remember which position he takes. Either way, and the rabbis outvote him, and they say, no, you're wrong. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, I'm right, and if I'm right, let the carob tree outside prove it. And the carob tree got up and moved by itself. And rest of the rabbis say, we don't accept that doesn't decide law for us. And Rabbi Eliezer said, I'm right, and if I'm so right, let the river outside let that prove it. And the river like shifts and runs the opposite direction. And rabbis say, sorry, we don't buy that. We don't buy that. That doesn't prove it for us. And Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm right, and if I'm so right, let the walls of this house of study prove it. And the walls start collapsing and teetering. And another Rabbi Yochanan, stands up and like, we're trying to study here and you're going to kill us? Come on, man. And the walls kind of like hover in mid-collapse because both Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Eliezer are like struggling between the two of them. And Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let God prove it. And a divine voice comes out of heaven and says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And Rabbi Yochanan says, sorry, we don't prove by divine voices. Torah's not in heaven. Sorry, buddy. We outvoted you, and you're wrong. And he says, and he quotes and Rabbi Yochanan quotes the Torah and says the Torah is not in heaven. So it's just a wonderful story, right? So once God gave the Torah to us, we decide, right? And we decide what God's will is. I think that's a revolutionary idea. We decide what God's will is, right? We study over God's word and we decide what God's will is. We argue about it and we decide. And no intervention by God is going to change our minds, right? And later on, at the very end of the story, Elijah the prophet shows up. Somebody says to Elijah, "Did you hear about what happened?" It's like, "Yeah, I heard about what happened back there." Well, what did God say? And God heard about it. What did God say? God said, "My children." God laughed and said, "My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me." Like, and so that's God's tacit approval that we're doing the right thing. And again, that shows that both, again, the style and form of what the rabbinic tradition is all about. And it really sets the stage for all future Jewish practice as we know it, that there's no normative tradition, right? That there are certain practices that we know look and feel Jewish, but as to the particulars of how they're done, that differs from community to community, and that's okay. In fact, that's encouraged, and very important teaching that I learned from one of my teachers, who learned it from one of his teachers. I think it came from Rabbi David Hartman, who said, if anyone says to you, Judaism says this, it's BS. I cleaned it up a little bit, but Judaism does not say this, right? Judaism has many ways to do things, right? If anybody ever tells you Judaism says this, they're full of blank, right? They're full of horse manure, because it's just not the case. It says lots of things about lots of things. So very, very important. Now, I want to say something also. I'm going to share this screen one more time. I want to say something also very, very important, historically speaking. So you see here in this chart that I have the term Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds, Palestine, Babylonia, right? Very important term, which we see a lot of, the word Palestine. So where did the word Palestine come from? and why do we use it, and why is it important, and why is it important to know where it comes from? Well, so this word comes from the Romans, and the word itself. Well, basically, what happened was that the Romans were sick of the Jews because only the Jews had rebelled against the Romans successfully twice. It's not just they did it once and kicked them out, but they did it twice and kicked them out, right? The revolt in 66 to 70, and the revolt of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135. And so the Romans were so sick of the Jews that they said, we are no longer going to call this land Judea anymore. We're going to try to blot out the memory of the Jews. So what do? They went through the histories of Herodotus. They went through the Bible, and they found a name: Philistines. The Philistines, who were the ancient enemies of the Israelites, right? We talked about the Philistines last week. They were Greek peoples who settled on the coast, and they found this name, the Romans. They said, Philistines. Well, let's rename this land after the Philistines, because we don't want to call it Judea anymore, because we don't want any memory of the Jews. So what do the Romans do? They renamed the land Palestine, or Palestina, and so that region came to be known Roman Palestine, and then as the land turned over between empire and empire over time, it retained its name that the Romans gave it as Palestine. But the Jewish name for it was always Eretz Yisrael, and the Jews never called it the Palestinian Talmud. They called it Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, even though it was put together in the Galilee, right, the north, not Jerusalem, because the Jews had very little access to Jerusalem, but they still called it the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, because of its Jerusalem centrality in memory and in that land. So very important that the name Palestine was the name of the region from after the Bar Kokhba revolt, because the Romans hated the Jews so much they wanted to blot out the memory of the Jews and rename the land so that it would not be called after the Jews anymore. Very important distinction and historical reference there. So then what we do is we enter the let me share my screen. So the rabbinic period is again truly transformative, and then we have the medieval period. If you see my little time chart, beginning with the year 700, right? The consolidation of legal traditions and liturgy, right? This is our Siddur comes into play here, our prayer book, right? And the first prayer book, it's very interesting. The first prayer book appears in a responsa. Basically, somebody writes a letter to very famous Rabbi Saadia Gaon in Babylonia, and says, how do I know what the prayers are? How do I recite them in the right order? And he writes back to them the liturgy that we have, right? So before him, people either memorized it or people just had it in their people just had one, scraps or a paper or one copy, but Saadia, in one of his letters, writes out what we know of as the Siddur. And then we have in the early, the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, the Masoretes. So the Masoretes take their name from the word Masora, which means tradition in Hebrew. And they basically consolidate the Torah text. There's a lot of, in the beginning of the Muslim period and the Christian and in early medieval Christianity, there's a real effort to consolidate and elucidate texts. And so the Masoretes are part of this, and they say, well, we should make our texts more readable, and we should make our texts unified so that we all have the same one. And so what they did was they were the ones who put the cantillation marks and the vowels and the chapter breaks. So how do we know how to read Torah specifically? How do we know how to pronounce words, right? Because Hebrew, remember, has no vowels. And what they did is they were the ones who put vowels into and cantillation marks, so we know how to chant it. We know where the chapter breaks are. It's actually very interesting that the Masoretic text, as we call it, the Jewish Bible, has in some cases different chapter breaks than the Christian Bible. Different verses are parsed out here and there. So it's very interesting this is at the same time as the Quran is being being organized, and the New Testament is being organized by chapter and verse specifically. So there's a general trend in the world of this happening. Let's go back to this. Oops. Here we go. And this is where Jewish life spreads all over the world, really. Right? That Jewish life goes from it's no longer centered in the land of Israel, but certainly Babylonia, and as far away as Spain and Morocco and Iraq and in Saudi Arabia and Yemen and into Europe, into Germany and France, and you have a lot of these things, these dates I have in the next few bullet points are happening at the same exact time, right? So you have Jewish life influences by Christianity and by Islamic civilizations, where you have on the one hand these negative aspects like persecutions and massacres, but on the other hand, creativity. Right, so you have major thinkers like Rashi, who is basically, Rashi is the number one biblical commentator, medieval biblical commentator, because he filters all of rabbinic tradition and organizes it, according to biblical text. So he interprets all of biblical text through the rabbinic tradition, and he lives in France, Franco-Germany, in the 11th century. You have Maimonides, who is in both then first Spain and then Egypt, developing systematic theology, and very much influenced by Aristotelian philosophy as brought to him through the Islamic tradition, and he creates a Judaism that is a rationalistic Aristotelian kind of Judaism, which is very radical, because Judaism and Aristotle are completely different. The Bible and Aristotle are completely different in thought. You have a lot of, and you have influences by other Islamic thought. You have Jewish mysticism in Spain and Germany. In Germany, called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Pietists of Germany. In Spain, you have what's called the mystics composed the Zohar, and the Zohar, again, written in Spain in the late 13th century. Now, the question about the Zohar is the central mystical text of Judaism, and the Zohar again interprets the Torah, verse by verse, right, from beginning to end, and yet it goes on amazing mystical tangents about the Sfirot, the system of 10 emanations that are the Godhead, and where you have Maimonides, the philosopher and rationalist, saying everything is God and we can't say anything about God. The mystics of the Zohar saying everything is God and we have to say everything about God. That for Maimonides, the only way you can define God is through negative attributes. God is not this, God is not that, God is, and for the mystics, God is everything. Everything in the world is the metaphor for God. So God is, the sun is this aspect of God. The moon is this aspect of God. The patriarchs are, and the matriarchs are all these aspects of God. God has the spirits are part of God's body, and they have different functions. And God has both masculine and feminine. God has the phallus and the womb. And so the mystics are saying God is everything, and everything in our life can be filtered through God. Where Maimonides says God is an intellectual pursuit through philosophical means. Both of these are happening at the same time, and it is, again, a time of immense Jewish creativity, and yet throughout all of this we have persecutions and massacres of Jews, right? So throughout the medieval period. And actually, before they say, I want to say one more thing, that they're influenced by the people around them. So Maimonides is very much influenced by the Aristotelian philosophy of the Islamic tradition, as I mentioned. The mystics of the Zohar are very much influenced by the chivalrous traditions of Europe, meaning like the mystics of the Zohar, as it composes, it thinks about the people of the time of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived 1,000 years before, and their group of mystics, and they are always on a mission to unite the masculine and feminine forces of God. It's almost like a knight rescuing a damsel in distress, and that comparison has actually been mentioned quite a bit, and seen by many scholars of Zohar. And also the question is whether the Zohar was written in Spain or whether it was revealed and put down on paper in Spain, and the traditions are actually 1,000 years old. That's very unclear. But even as you have all this creativity, you have all these persecutions. Where, as I mentioned, see all these dates here. There's persecutions and massacres in the Rhinelands and in England, in France and in Spain and in Poland as late as 1648, which we'll get to later. Ritual burning of the Talmud, and in Italy, there's exiles of the Jews. Like the first country to kick out Jews was Spain in 1290, 1291, France 1309, most famously Spain in 1492, and Portugal 1496. And notice all of these countries are in Europe. Very important to know, and this is where we really get serious, the beginnings of anti-Semitism, of Jew hatred as we know it, in the sense that, as I mentioned last time, if you're a polytheistic society, if you worship many gods, Jews are weird, but they're not bad, right? You only worship one God? What's up with that? I mean, you're a little, like, that's strange, but okay, fine, you do your thing. But when you have the rise of Christianity, you have people and the libels that grow out of that, like, not just, and it's not just you worship, Christianity in its most supersessionist thought said, we are the new Israel, you are rejected by God, and not only that, you killed our God, right? And so that's a very big change for the Jewish experience. And if you believe wrong, you've been rejected, and you killed God, so therefore we don't like you. In fact, we hate you, and we're going to persecute you because you're doing the wrong thing completely. And in Islam was having a golden age at around these times, and Islam worshipped God in an even less concrete ritualistic way than Jews do. And so for Islam, being Jewish is not a problem. You're not part of the Ummah. You're not part of the people who are counted among the adherents of Allah and Muhammad. And you're second-class citizens, but ritually speaking, religiously speaking, you're not doing anything wrong. But for Christian Europe, Jews are doing something wrong, right? You're worshiping the wrong God, and God has rejected you, and you killed our God. So that's where this religious anti-Semitism really comes to, and this is why you have massacres and exiles, because you can do that. You can kill Jews if you think they've worshiped the wrong God, killed your God, and are not chosen anymore, have been rejected by God. So that's why we have a lot of these repeated exiles and things like that. And then of course the Crusades are around this time. Several of them, the Crusades, where Christianity wanted to reclaim the Holy Land for them from the Islamic empires at the time, and Jews, of course, are caught in the middle of that. Let me share one. Go back to my screen one more time. So again, it's a time of great creativity, but it's also a time of persecution as well. And one of the results of these exiles, especially the exile from Spain, because Spain was a golden age in the 12th and 13th and even 14th centuries, with the Islamic kingdoms there and the Jews. Right, that's where Maimonides was, and many other Abravanel and Yehuda Levi, so many others. But Salman ibn Gabriel, and again, just so much creativity coming out of Spain before the Inquisition and expulsion from Spain. And so when you have the expulsion from Spain, you not only have a diaspora, you have a diaspora by diaspora, meaning you have Spanish Jews who are kicked out and go everywhere. You have Spanish Jews who go to North Africa, who go to Turkey, who go back to the land of Israel. You have some Spanish Jews who go to this crazy unconquered place called the New World, that's way across the sea, and what the heck's over there? Who knows? But it's a new start, and we'll come back to that next time. But you have and you have the people who leave Spain take their mystical texts with them, and as you see here, the bottom, revival of Jewish mysticism in Tzfat or Safed, Tzfat in the land of Israel, Palestine, led by Yosef Karo and Isaac Luria the Ari. And then you have Lurianic Kabbalah, the beginning of this new idea, that this reinterpreted mystical tradition, and a compilation of Jewish law by Yosef Karo. You have the mystics who basically invent many and write many parts of our service today, like the Kabbalat Shabbat service and Lecha Dodi and many other, and Yedid Nefesh, many poems that welcome in the Sabbath, because the Sabbath in the mystical tradition is personified as a bride and a queen. And so there's the elaborate service of welcoming the bride and the queen on Shabbat. And there's also a compilation of Jewish law. Now, and this is very interesting that I think a lot of modern liberal Jews don't think about as much, but the earliest these really the Shulchan Aruch, this very authoritative legal code, comes from the mystics. Why? Because if you believe that you can access God through, and you can connect with God through everything, in every possible experience, you need to know how to do it the right way, right? And so the mystics are the ones who write these legal codes to show you this is the way we do these things in order to do them. Now, of course, as soon as Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch is written, a generation later, a man named Moshe Isserlis in Poland writes a commentary on it, because he basically says, well, that's how you do it in your communities in the land of Israel, but what about us in Poland? This is how we do it. So he writes a commentary for Ashkenazi Jews of Europe, as opposed to Mizrahi Jews of the land of Israel. By the way, I need to go back a little bit, because it's part of the ongoing conversation. Maimonides, in his audacity, says, I'm going to write a law code that's going to be so important that, I think I mentioned this to you 2 weeks ago. I'm going to write a law code that's going to be so important you only need this law code and the Bible. You don't need anything else. And as soon as he writes his law code, people start writing commentaries on his law code. Because that's not how you do it. You don't say this is my law code, but people write commentaries on the law code because that's not how we do it. And this is how we do it. And Maimonides also has the gall to say, these are the principles of faith that every Jew should believe. And then people write commentaries back on that and say, well, what does that mean? What do you mean that we should believe this? What is that? And so it kind of becomes normative, but people aren't. But people are still arguing about what principles of faith are. And again, Maimonides came from a place of having to believe things because he was an Aristotelian philosopher, or a philosopher based in Aristotle. One of my professors of rabbinical school, one of my teachers of rabbinical school, said, and after we read Maimonides, we're reading Maimonides, and he sounds nothing like any of the other Jewish codes or Jewish thinkers we're reading. And he's like, there's a reason why, because Maimonides took the same philosophy 101 class that we all took in college. And so he read Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and he took the same philosophy 101 class. He knows Western philosophy. The rabbis don't think that, or linearly like that. And so that's why the rabbinic tradition and Midrash is just all over the place with all its free associative thinking. But Maimonides took the same philosophy 101 class that we all took, which is why Maimonides reads very systematically. But again, he's the outlier. And again, even in the midst of these persecutions in Europe, Poland became, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, became a center of Talmud study. And Poland and Lithuania, all these places in Eastern Europe, became a center of Talmud study. Okay, I'm going to stop there, catch my breath, and anybody have any questions?
Yes. Al?
Yeah.
All right. The Crusades.
Yeah.
You said like the Jews were kind of like caught in the middle.
Right.
Was it more that they were living relatively peacefully among the Islamic State, and they became a target for the Christian Crusaders because they were relatively peaceful in the Islamic State?
No, let me rephrase. So let me explain a little more. So the Jews became a target. The Jews of Christian Europe became a target. So it's when armies from Europe were going to the Middle East, marching across Europe, they massacred Jews there. Not specifically in Islam and in Islamic lands, because they didn't really conquer many Islamic lands. They held the land of Israel, of Palestine, for some time, but maybe about 100 years. And the Jews certainly fared a little bit better under Islam, but I'm specifically talking about the Jews of Europe who got massacred, towns that got massacred on the way. They're like, hey, we're going to reclaim the Holy Land, and by the way, here are those God killers, and let's go. We're on a holy mission, so let's go kill the God killers and the God deniers and all that stuff. So that's kind of what I'm talking about.
The other question I have, and you just started to talk about Poland and Eastern Europe, and again, maybe you're going to cover this another time, but that's about the time, the 16th, 17th century when the Hasidic movement came along, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that next week. Yeah. Or maybe I'll start on it tonight after in a couple of minutes after we have a little break. But yeah, so that's I was gonna get to that in a little bit. Yeah.
All right, I'm good.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
When people who I guess would call themselves Orthodox very often say, the Torah or the Bible were written by God, and therefore, mere humans cannot question what is written. But based on what you just said, that's not really the Jewish feeling on the subject, that it is supposed to be interpreted by people. So how do people make sense of those two different feelings?
So I think we read, I think we understand the term fundamentalism wrong, especially when it comes to the Jewish tradition, because any Orthodox Jew, especially traditional ones, will affirm the diversity of Torah and will affirm the diversity of traditions, and acknowledge that there are different ways of doing things if you live in this community or that community. And they will affirm all the contradictory midrashim. They won't affirm them as contradictory, but they will certainly say that it's not that we don't question the Word of God, it's that the Word of God is revealed in a multiplicity of ways, and what traditional Judaism will say is that on Mount Sinai, God revealed both the written Torah and the oral Torah. Meaning, it's not that that according to this line of thought, it's not that these traditions were written down in the Mishnah and then in the Gemara and then in the legal codes as a creative way of adapting Judaism, but rather they were written down. Traditions were orally passed down for hundreds of years and eventually written down so that they could be better preserved. Right? It's kind of ironic that the oral tradition is written in so many books. Right? The written tradition is only very, very small. It's the Torah, right? But it's the oral tradition that fills the shelves worth of books. And so I think so. So there is still the acknowledgement of the creativity, but the hard line position of which you are speaking only becomes vocalized in the modern period when there is reform, and we'll get to that next week specifically. Right? The such a hard line position on what tradition is only a modern idea, right? And we'll talk about that specifically because Orthodox Judaism is only a modern idea, where we say there was no such thing as Orthodox Judaism before the year 1800, right? Right? It's the effort to preserve what they think is traditional, and as we'll see next week, it only applies to the European experience because the Jews of the Middle East had no major reforms. That's why you'll have Middle Eastern Jews who have a traditional form of Judaism and are much more open to adaptation because there was not this this break of break with tradition and attempt to preserve tradition. It's just, this is tradition. It evolves. This is what we do. This is what we don't do. We know it's there. Sometimes we do it. Sometimes we don't. Right? And so it's a very different experience, which again I'll talk about next week in more detail. Any other questions? Okay, well, I have a couple of minutes left, so we'll talk a little bit about this, and we'll get really into the weeds next week. In that we have specifically in Europe that that Harvey mentioned a moment ago, that as I spoke about and I just showed you a little while ago, that you have this the very bottom of the right column, important period of Talmudic study in Poland. Now, part of this, one of the results of this development of Talmudic study is that both study of Talmud and study of Kabbalah, of the mystical tradition in these academies, became very erudite, very much so much so that if you didn't have a masterful education and a rigorous education, you couldn't access the tradition. And so as a result of that, I'm going to scroll down here for a second. As a result of that, you have it says emergence of new patterns of Jewish life due to social and ideological revolutions in Europe and challenges to old rabbinical structures in Eastern Europe, development of secular Jewish enlightenment, we'll get to that more next week, and religious reform movements in Western Europe, pietistic revival known as Hasidism under the spiritual leadership of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov in Eastern Europe. Right, a combination. Okay, so as a result of the intensification and erudition and classism, really, of Talmud and study of Kabbalah, you have this pietistic popular movement started by Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, who died in the year 1750, which is the beginning of the Hasidic movement. And the Hasidic movement really is a revival movement, as it says here, a pietistic revival, meaning that you don't need to be a great Talmud scholar to access God. God is everywhere. God is, and God is accessible through every experience. God is accessible through a festive meal and through eating and drinking and enjoying the joys of life, and through singing and dancing, and where the academies were very much closed off and erudite, these Hasidic masters were going to the people, were talking to the people and preaching to the people, and saying, this is Judaism. This is your tradition. Your tradition is about being joyful and enjoying the world, and singing and dancing, and that's the beginning of Hasidism. And the Hasidism as we know it today has become much more legalistic. There's a reason for that, which we'll get to next week. But Hasidism in its earliest forms was a pietistic revival that lowered barriers for the everyday Jew, which is why it became so popular and caught on like wildfire in Poland. And the Baal Shem Tov created a circle of followers that spread his messages throughout all of Eastern Europe. And again, this is also during the time when you have the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment ideal of number one, on the one hand, Jews learning Western and secular thought for its own sake and to enter society, and on the other hand, Western society opening up to Jews, opening itself up to Jews, which we'll talk about more in detail next week, and what the implications for that are. And then, importantly, but really not on anybody's radar screen whatsoever, is a handful of Jews who land in New Amsterdam in the Western world in 1654, and also a handful of Jews who had come to Brazil and had come to some of the islands of the Caribbean in their either exile from Spain, or their exile or leaving Portugal, or as explorers leaving the Netherlands and other places like that. And so you have the beginnings of European settlement And along with that, you have small groups of Jews who are landing and settling and building and figuring out what to do with this place everybody calls the New World. So we will stop there. Next week, we're going to finish our journey of the modern period. Again, talking about the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, as they call it, the birth of European Judaism, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative Judaism, Zionism, Judaism's explosion in America, and the development of an understanding of peoplehood again in the land of Israel. The Shoah will cover all that next week, and that'll catch us up to the modern period. Any final thoughts, questions?
Okay.
Yeah, just regarding the Hasidim,
Yeah.
are you going to touch at all on how they adapted their style of clothing that they wear? I've read that the Hasidic clothing is based on a Polish Gentile aristocracy clothing or whatever. I mean,
so
if you want to hold off on that, then cool.
I mean, look, it goes to why and how the Hasidic movement started off as a pietistic popular revival movement and became a strict legalistic kind of movement. And we'll talk about that specifically why next week. All right. Well,
Thank you.
yeah, we'll see everybody. I'm sorry, Danny, do you have a question?
Sorry, so just waving my arm around.
Oh, okay. All right. So we'll see everyone next Tuesday evening at 7:30, and we'll conclude this journey and through the Jewish experience next week.
Thank you.